All right. Hi. Sorry again. Sorry I'm late. I'm 2 minutes late here. I'm coming from a different class, and there were a number of questions, right? So I figured drag for a few more minutes before I transition to this class. I do apologize for that. We'll make up for the 2 minutes. So we'll, instead of 18:35, we'll up to 18:38. All right. So we're just gonna pause here, and can I ask that whoever has the microphone on, Roy, do you want to switch it off? Thank you. Yes, it's you, right? So I don't know if people have any specific questions with regards to what we looked at the last time we met. Can't remember when. But we did quite a bit here, and we got into a stage where we can finally go out there and apply an appropriate elicitation technique to start gathering the requirements associated with whatever project we are working on, right? The different projects that we're working towards. So we focused on, we wrapped up actually, but we spent quite a bit of time discussing or looking at certain types of elicitation techniques, because we mentioned that we expect the vast majority of you to make use of those techniques, right? And you notice that we've wrapped up, by the way, the elicitation techniques, right? I kept on reminding us that literally every one of us, okay, every one of us is going to, all the groups are going to have to do some sort of document analysis. The question to ask here is, what document are you going to be analyzing, right? So that's one thing. Almost all the groups are going to have to do some aspect of system interface analysis. Why? Because all of you are supposed to build these systems or software tools that interface with external services. Think of this from the perspective of Moodle integration, Google Calendar integration, Google Groups integration, WhatsApp integration, right? In all these different scenarios, situations, or projects, you're going to have to go out there and understand exactly how the web service is meant to behave as you're interacting with it. And then we spent, again, a bit of time looking at interviews. And the reason we spent a bit of time looking at interviews is we expect most, if not all, the groups to actually take advantage of the interview technique, right? Why? Because it turns out it's one of the most effective techniques out there. Also, some of these techniques that would be quite useful, like observations, workshop sessions, and focus group discussions, are not going to be possible because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also expect some people to take advantage of questionnaires here. Even more interesting, we looked at what others have, certain metrics that other people have come up with, right? Really nice metrics that kind of highlight.
Sorry, sir. I don't know if you're aware that you haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh my God. No, I wasn't aware of that. Sorry, thanks for that. There we go. Thanks a lot. We're going to go through thing, talking about would be like one of those weird presentations. But we also looked at, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we also looked at certain metrics that smart people out there have come up with, right? So metrics that will show you the different techniques that you can potentially apply to your project relative to the type of project, the different characteristics associated with the project. So for instance, if you're producing mass market software, right? These people prescribe that you use these techniques: interviews, focus group discussions, questionnaires. They're developing some corporate package, right? A package that's supposed to be used for, let's say, Stanbic Bank Zambia or something, or UNZA, right? An HR platform for UNZA. You know that you'd have to take advantage of interviews, workshops, and workshops make sense here. Why? You have multiple stakeholders that would use this internal corporate piece of software. Observations, because typically most of these corporate softwares that are used internally in these corporate organizations will involve workflows, right? And we mentioned that Workshops are perfect for doing that. Why? You have the opportunity to interact with multiple stakeholders at any given point in time and to be able to sort out whatever conflicts that might arise, conflicting requirements. You're interacting with a student, they tell you, this is how I want the software to be. You go and speak to a lecturer, another vested stakeholder, they tell you, no, I don't think that feature should be implemented in that way, right? So a workshop is perfect for ironing out conflicts. Right, so we looked at this, but I want to draw your attention to this idea of, before we transition here to the example, I want to draw your attention to this idea of system interface analysis, because it turns out that it's extremely important. I recommended that you look into a platform, a piece of software called Postman. I don't know how many of you have started doing this as a group. If you want this to work, you want to look into that, right? You already want to start poking around how these different application programming interfaces behave relative to a particular response that you send to it, so that you know beforehand exactly how you are going to write code that is going to automate that process, back and forth process. Because essentially, as we've been taught in 3010, as we are taught in EDU 1020, these things we are calling web services are centered around something very simple. It's client-server architecture and the so-called request-response cycle. Client initiates contact by sending through a request to a server. The server will process the request and send back a response. The response might either be an error message in the event that the request is malformed, or if the resource does not exist, or it might include a payload that has the details that the user wants. It's a very simple thing here, extremely simple actually. And I gave you examples. I told you that I was giving an example of a platform that we've been playing around with for quite some time now, called an institutional repository software. And so the way this works is, anyway, it's implemented with a RESTful API. So there's an application programming interface that you can use to interact with a piece of software remotely. Because you can interact with it remotely, you can build layered services, external services that will interact with that application without necessarily being incorporated in that piece of software, right? Remember here our discussion of 1110 that the alternative would be, oh, no, we're going to build a plugin or an add-on for the software. Well, maybe you don't want to be caught up in the mess of the software in the event that there's an upgrade, you don't want to upgrade your plugin, you just develop a completely separate interface. And you do that by taking advantage of the RESTful API. The RESTful API you understand by doing a document analysis. You read the documentation. Moodle has documentation for how the API for Moodle works. Google Calendar has documentation for how Google Calendar works. You must read the documentation. You must identify the endpoints. There are usually different endpoints for reading information, for writing information, for deleting information, for updating information. You must identify updating is put. Post is creating new information, get is reading information, deleting is deleting, right? Could. You must go out there and identify which REST endpoints for Moodle are applicable for the features specific to your application. AKA, if you're a group that is building that markup request application, think how, as you're reading up on the API, which endpoints are you going to have to use for you to be able to interact with Moodle, for the application to behave the way it should behave, right? System interface analysis. So it's a combination of document analysis and system interface analysis, but I told you last week, the last time we met, that the system interface analysis works best if you use already available tools like Postman, and I cannot recommend this tool more than I did last week, right? Please do this. Find time, poke around. It's simple to install. There should be a Chrome plugin, last time I checked. But very easy to use. All you do is you feed it with, if you wanted to interact with a particular endpoint. What you do is you feed it the URL that corresponds to that RESTful API endpoint. Like in this case, I know that the endpoint is this. Sorry, I know that the base URL is this. The endpoint that I want to list all the items is just items. No parameters required, right? So I'll just copy this, paste it here, and then it's a get request that I need to make. They told you this in EDU 1020, right? Get, put, post, delete, right? These are all different things that, I don't know if you discussed this in EDU 1020 during your discussion of the internet or computer networks and the internet, right? So if I send this request, I will get back a response. The response is what you're going to process. Request response. I mentioned last week that your response will typically be well structured. Because it's well structured, aka it has a predefined structure, programming or automating that structure is trivial. It's the same structure, right? So automation it won't be a problem, right? Right, I don't know if people have any, I hope you've started, has anybody bothered to look into these different things we're talking about? Like if you go to Google Calendar API, has anybody, as a group, looked into this? Document analysis? Hello? I'm not sure if I'm still connected here, but am I still connected? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. Has anybody bothered to look into this document analysis thing? Any group so far? If you are working with the Google Calendar API, right? You mentioned that you go to the documentation page, look at this, it's easy, right? You go here and then you start playing around with this. You notice if I wanted to list events, I guess our calendar ID is my calendar, right? Observe, I'll just say this is my calendar ID. Of course, you need to automate the authentication part. In most instances, when you're working with Google APIs, all you have to do is create an API key. There are processes, the documentation has details on how you go about doing that. But you'll notice that very soon, once I authorize Google Calendar API to interact with my calendar, I get back this. You see this? I have these details here, right? Don't know if you can see this here. Work-related schedule. I have, these are the events here with the location. I'm trying to check for a most recent event that I can, I don't know if people can see this, but if I copy, wow. Oops, sorry about that. If I copy this, right? And if I paste this response here, this is what you'll be processing, right? Previous stuff here. And you can see that these things here, there's a predefined structure, and the structure conforms to the events. Event name is in the description. Notice is not description, but I guess it would be this summary, right? So if I start searching for summary, full colon, I'll be able to see the different events associated with my personal calendar, right? School of Education postgraduate exams with the dates. I have monthly UNZA Keep Clean Day, right? Launch of the new UNZA strategic plan. So notice that the only thing you have to do, the only thinking that is here is how you're going to process this output, right? So if you're working with events from a calendar, for instance, you know that you'd have to figure out a way of processing the dates, right? Processing the dates so that you find empty slots, for instance, right? Oh wow, these are odd though, because I'm pulling all the events. You notice that these events are from 2018. But if I scroll down to the bottom here, you notice that I have some more recent events like meeting with LIS 2014 groups of students, right? It turns out that interacting with APIs like Moodle is equally trivial. There's no complexity associated with it. The only thing you have to do is you go out there and figure out exactly what sort of RESTful endpoint you have to work with, right? And I told you, for Moodle, all you have to do is Google up Moodle API, and there's a slew of documentation. Stack Overflow is is flooded with questions and threads that are associated with how you get to process information when you're interacting with the Moodle API. If you go to the Moodle documentation, you notice that they are predefined. There's details of the different endpoints. All you have to do as a group, when you're reading this documentation, you're doing document analysis, you identify the relevant endpoints that you're going to be working with. Once you do that, you will then start experimenting with the different endpoints to interact with it, right? System interface analysis to see exactly what sort of response you get back when you send out a request. It's not that hard. And also, something to think about here is what you should be asking yourself if your group is working with Moodle. I don't know if you bother to ask yourselves, which Moodle instance are you going to be using for your test? Have you thought about this? Have you guys installed Moodle for your respective groups or something? If you don't want to answer, then okay, that's fine. That's something to think about, right? When you're doing these tests, especially if your tests involve like writing data to Moodle, things that will not allow you to work with the production instance of Moodle, the one that we have currently available. The testing would have to be done using a sandbox, an experimental instance. So either your group installs Moodle, a Moodle instance of your own, or alternatively, fortunately for you, and you can even install Moodle, by the way. Fortunately for you, you can make use. You can just Google up. A lot of smart people have set up Moodle test instances, and I do believe I've come across. I wonder if I remember Moodle demo API site. I've come across a Moodle demo API site. This, right? So if you're working with Moodle, as you're doing your system interface analysis, I do encourage your group to please go here. Please go here. And then just try and figure out exactly how you go about interacting with that instance, right? What you will realize, right, as you're working through the different instances, is that you can already start playing around with. So if you look at this, and I don't know if you are wasting time. I don't know. Has any group looked into this, by the way? System interface analysis. Has any group not looked into this? I'm going to wait for a response because I think it would be nice if you guys had some sort of response here. Those of you working on Moodle, have you started interacting with have you started doing system interface analysis to try and see how the API works?
We looked at it just to understand it, but we haven't gone in depth.
Okay. Yeah. What you'll notice that is it's not that hard, right? So I do encourage you, as I sent through a link here, as you are thinking of setting up your own Moodle instance, you can use this sandbox. But the way this sandbox works is data is paged from the platform, I think in 24-hour cycles, right? So whatever test data you're going to put in there, you're going to have to repopulate it over and over again as you're doing your tests. But a simple technique is just to use one of these cloud service providers, right? Like what? Heroku or something. I think you can do that on Heroku and then just set up a Moodle instance that you can use as a test. Something else we can do is try and see if we can set up a test Moodle instance on one of our servers. But please use this sandbox. Now, if you look at this sandbox, right, what you'll notice from Moodle when you're reading up on the API documentation is that the very first thing you're going to have to do is authenticate yourself, right? And authenticating yourself is not that hard. I guess you can take advantage of a platform like Carl. And I'm going to just, I'm using these credentials that are here, by the way, in case you're wondering. I just want to show you how easy it is to do this. I'm going to use these credentials here on this test server instance of ours. These credentials here. When you go to the test server, they will tell you that for you to log into the sandbox, these are the credentials, right? So these are the credentials I'm using. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to attempt to, first thing I need is I need to generate a token, right? And I'm just using sandbox because the password here is sandbox, admin sandbox, or student sandbox. Student sandbox. And then I am going to issue this endpoint here. And what you notice from the documentation in Moodle is they'll tell you that for you to get the token that you're going to use for your application, this is what you have to do, right? So there's nothing new here. I'm just doing what is specified in the documentation. And I have to do that, I guess. So if I run this here, I should be able to get back a JSON response with a token. I don't know if you can see this. So using this token here that I've gotten back, I can then issue other requests, right? Request, response. So I get back a response. The next thing I have to do is, because there are certain, or as I was going to say, there are certain endpoints that require you to specify the user. So there's a particular endpoint that you use for you to extract the user. But let's say I wanted to just get, if I just wanted to get courses in this Moodle instance, all I would have to do is go to the actual, use the RESTful API endpoints that corresponds to WF function, I guess, that lets me to list the courses. But the only thing I would have to do is I would have to specify the token, right? So what you notice from the documentation is that the process you go through for you to do this is slightly different, right? So you first of all specify the token, which we've just gotten right now. And then you specify the function, right? So this will be the endpoint that you want to access. So I'm just going to see if we can access I hope this works, but we can access the core courses. And I know some of these endpoints, by the way, because I have been playing around with Moodle for some time. There's some pet projects that we are wanting to see if we can build or implement, right? Then I would have the actual RESTful API endpoint like so. And what you notice is that the vast majority of web services these days will typically, by default, they'll spit out the response in JSON format, right? So if you see this is the format that's coming through from course ID number 2 there. But it's not uncommon to find a web service that spits out information, let's say XML. It's one of the same thing. All of these things, all the different data formats have a predefined structure. What you're doing is you're processing the predefined structure yourself. So I can pipe this to see if we can, I'm just going to see if I can format this appropriately, right? So this is what you'd be doing, right? If you're working with Moodle, you can see that the course ID number 2, right, has these details associated with it. Topic 3, right, those topics you see in Moodle, depending on how the different sections, depending on how the different lecturers that you have organize their content in Moodle. Lighton does it different. I don't use topics, right? Is this making sense? The key thing here is the client-server architecture, right? And the request response workflow. When you're interacting with an external service, you send a request, you get back a response, you process a response. You must make sure you're sending the correct request. How do you know you're sending the correct request? Documentation. All right. If there are no questions, then I guess we'll continue with why we are here today. I thought today would be a perfect time for me to walk us through a case example. Now, the reason I'm walking us through this case example is twofold. Number one, to highlight the variation of elicitation techniques that you end up using in a real-world setting. Now, granted, this case example we consider this a toy example. I mean, it's envisioned to be production quality software, but it's not as sophisticated as this large-scale software tools like Facebook and Microsoft Office packages, right? But so I want you to keep in mind, take note of the different elicitation techniques, but also we are using it as a basis for the subsequent topics that we're going to cover. So the things that we're going to cover, we'll use this same case example. The Moodle has a document with the requirements and functional and non-functional requirements. Those will evolve. But anyways, so the case example is going to be broken down as follows. I'll briefly talk about the problem statement, the problem we're trying to solve. And then I'll point at the key stakeholders associated with this application that we're building. And then we'll quickly go through the elicitation techniques that we went through to identify potential requirements associated with this application. All right, so it turns out that the UNZA has the so-called institutional repository, right? And what this piece of software is used for is it's used to archive, so to store and make available scholarly research output that's generated by the University of Zambia, right? So the people that teach you, that lecture you, are not paid just to lecture you. They are paid to do research and to do community service. When people do research, they produce scholarly research output. So journal articles and conference papers, conference presentations, these things are stored into a piece of software, or they're archived using a piece of software that's referred to as an institutional repository. UNZA currently uses DSpace, an off-the-shelf application, to make available these digital objects or the scholarly research output. In case you're wondering, for you to gain access to DSpace at UNZA, I do encourage you to go there. It's nice if you want to thoroughly understand what this case example is all about. Now, the problem that says that the ingestion of these scholarly research output that's produced at the UNZA is done by very few faculty staff in the library. Currently, it's just 2 individuals. Now, this is too much work for 2 individuals. Why is it too much work? Because you're looking at content that's generated by postgraduate students, a lot of them, and also faculty staff. Last time we counted, we had a total of about 854 plus faculty staff. The number has probably increased by now. So all these different actors or entities who produce scholarly research output that is ideally supposed to be stored into the institutional repository, and you have 2 people that are supposed to do this. The problem with that is that the content, there's a backlog of content. So if you go to the UNZA institutional repository, you notice that we are still in the process of updating or uploading content that was generated in 2018 and in 2019. Even we're still with the digitization efforts that have currently been pioneered at the UNZA, right? So this is a problem here. There's a huge backlog. And then also, because there's just 2 people involved in this process, there are a number of errors associated with metadata linked to the Square research output that's ingested into the repository. So this is a problem. To address this problem, the problem of backlog and correct metadata, the proposal is to build a third-party application that will make it possible for digital objects to be correctly, efficiently, and effectively ingested into the repository. And this third-party application is specifically meant to handle a particular type of metadata. Those are electronic theses and dissertations. So Square research output generated by postgraduate students. And the idea behind this is we would, instead of having these two individuals deposit content into the repository, you would have postgraduate students log into this third-party application and deposit the content on their own, right? So first thing we did was went out there and we identified the range of stakeholders, so the set of stakeholders associated with the project, and we realized that there are quite a number of them. Primary stakeholder, key stakeholder is the postgraduate student, the person who's going to be ingesting content into this third-party application, right? So this would be masters and doctoral students so far. But we also have faculty staff who supervise these postgraduate students. The structure at the UNZA is such that a master's or PhD student has a supervisor. In other places they're called advisors at doctoral, at PhD level anyway. But so you have a faculty staff that will supervise the PhD students. There are assistant deans who are responsible for research. These are mostly concerned with the quality of the output here. So these are all stakeholders. Assistant Dean, Postgraduate Studies. People from the Directorate of Research and Graduate Studies, DRGS. This is the entity that's responsible for postgraduate studies. And then the library staff, the unit in the library that is responsible for the institutional repository. So you notice the first thing we did was we identified the broad spectrum of stakeholders. But this list is by no means comprehensive because this piece of software is supposed to be interfaced with an application that is installed within the UNZA environment. Then immediately get an appreciation of the fact that the people in CICT, the database administrators, the people that handle the backups and that troubleshoot problems when something goes wrong are stakeholders as well. The university library also happens to have tech-savvy individuals that are employed. They're called system librarians. These are stakeholders as well. And of course, the general public, so the people that will access this platform, right? The DSpace platform that I spoke about here. Again, you will notice that we went through a thorough process of identifying the list of all potential stakeholders. It does not necessarily mean that when we are eliciting requirements, we go and interact with all of these entities. In certain instances, yes, but in some instances, perhaps not. Right? So we have a list of stakeholders. For us to elicit the requirements, and by the way, we've been at this for the last, it's almost 2 years now. We are still, the piece of software is being built in phases. We've done, I guess we are maybe 20% done with the piece of software. There's still work to be done here. We've implemented the machine learning models, but the actual user interface that we're supposed to implement hasn't yet been implemented. But it turns out that we've taken advantage of so far the following elicitation techniques for us to gather the requirements that we need. Right? The point I want to draw attention to here is that when you're eliciting requirements, it doesn't necessarily mean that you must use one technique. It is possible that you might find yourself using a broad spectrum of techniques, a variation of techniques. And this makes sense because if you find yourself in a situation where you have no idea how the domain works, you have no idea who the stakeholders are, then you'd have to identify an appropriate elicitation technique that will help you analyze the different stakeholders first. Once you identify the stakeholders, you use an appropriate techniques to collect or to gather the requirements. You might have to undergo a process where you identify the potential sources of requirements. So you'd have to, first of all, go out there, identify the stakeholders, key stakeholders, and then interact with them so that you identify where exactly you're going to elicit the requirements from. So for instance, if you're building that makeup request application and you don't know which stakeholders to go and interact with, the first thing you have to do is perhaps interact with who you think is the primary stakeholder, in this case, the lecturer. Maybe you go and interview Lighton. As you are interacting with Lighton, you ask him, so which other individuals or stakeholders do you think we should speak to so that we identify the set of comprehensive requirements, right? I hope this is making sense. So it turns out that we went through this thorough process of doing this. In terms of document analysis, we've primarily been looking at archival records associated with metadata and actual bit streams, actual PDF documents are in the repository right now, right? So we work with current, I think last time we checked, we had a little over 3,500 electronic theses and dissertations, right? So we pull that information and we analyze, as part of the document analysis process, we're analyzing the metadata. The analysis of the metadata is based on it can be viewed from different angles here, but key thing here is we are using bond digital objects, in this case metadata and the PDF documents, to analyze pre-existing records. Key takeaway point here is when you're doing a document analysis, it's not always the case that you're going to be working with forms. There are instances where you'll be working with archival records. I gave an example, I don't know if it was in the previous lecture or the other lecture, where in the most recent past, in my previous life, I did a document analysis that involved a segment analysis of video recorded lectures, right? Different type of data, but it's still document analysis or archival record analysis. We've also done a number of interviews. So as an example, in 2018, we worked with a group of fourth years that, as part of their capstone project, they were conducting interviews to try and elicit requirements. So we are using output from those interview sessions as input into deriving the set of requirements, right? So key thing here is interviews, and these interviews were conducted with library staff in this case. If you need details about this, you can just go here. You should be able to find details of the interview sessions here. Last year, we again worked with a group of fourth years, and as part of their capstone project, they conducted a focus group discussion with library staff. Now you notice, even though the stakeholders being interacted with are more or less the same, or they're coming from the same department or the same unit or faculty in the university, but the information that we are eliciting from these entities is different. Like last year, what we were interested in is information specific to controlled vocabularies associated with these items that are ingested into the repository. When we interviewed faculty staff in 2018, we were interested in the workflow they go through to ingest content into the repository. Right? So something else we've done extensively here is system interface analysis. And the reason we're doing system interface analysis is because we mentioned here that we are building as a solution. The proposed solution is a third-party application. This is a third-party application that is going to be interfaced with the existing institution repository, DSpace. For us to be able to interact with this DSpace, we went out there and read the documentation. DSpace has a RESTful API. We also know that DSpace has a number of web services. DSpace has or it implements SWORD protocol, right? DSpace also implements OIPMH protocol. And so we did a document analysis and settled for this. So we've decided to interact with the RESTful API as opposed to using SWORD or using the OIPMH protocol, just because interacting with a RESTful API is, for the most part, it's a bit intuitive, right? It's not as complicated or as foreign as these web services like SWORD version 2, for instance. And in fact, SWORD is only specific for depositing content, so putting content into the repository. So if you look at the interaction of web services from the perspective of the HTTP request here, HTTP request method, SOD version 2 only implements the put request, right? But what we want to do with this third-party application is issue get requests, issue post requests, issue delete requests, you know, all the good stuff here. OIPMH protocol is only used for reading data from a repository. So if we were to use this, it would only be useful if we wanted to read, to get information. But this third-party application is supposed to do much more than that. All right. For interviews and focus group discussions, we did a system interface analysis. It's been rigorous. And because of this, actually, we know exactly sort of architecture is going to be associated by this third-party application. We can draw a context diagram to highlight the key entities that get to interface or interact with this application. Right? It's much easier because we've done our homework, right? So in terms of some, not all of them, some, right? There's a whole list of functional requirements, and hopefully you should be able to see them in the SRS document that we're going to share, right? That you'll use that as a reference as you're developing your own respective SRS documents. So some example functional requirements is we want this third-party application to be able to automatically classify object collections. We also want it to be able to automatically classify object subjects, right? Subject headings. We also needed to classify the different DDMS elements associated with the metadata. And more importantly, because we are creating new things, because we are updating things that will exist in the repository, we want this application to be able to perform the basic CRUD applications. Remember the CRUD applications from 2010? I don't know if you've discussed this, but create, read, update, delete, right? So this application is going to make it possible for us to create new things, to view existing things, to correct existing things by way of updating them, to get rid of existing things by deleting them. So CRUD operations. We don't want every Jim and Jack to be able to log into this application. So obviously, it will have to implement some sort of authentication and authorization module, right? And what we want to do is to avoid people from forgetting their passwords. We want to implement single sign-on, where someone maybe just logs on with their UNZA email address or UNZA account, and they use the same password. Similar to what you guys do with SIS, right? SIS and Moodle integration. And then because this is a third-party application, we want it to be able to synchronize information that's put into this application should be synchronized with the main instruction repository. The role of this third-party application is to add content or synchronize with content into the repository. And obviously, because we are implementing this authentication and authorization module, we want to implement user management as part of this application, right? So we want to be a feature where a user can be added, can be deleted, a user can be disabled, right? All the good stuff associated with user management. Very soon, guys, this list has much more than 7 functional requirements, and in fact, when converting these into system requirements, you notice that they become slightly more complex, right? And in certain instances, you can fragment them into different entities. During requirements analysis, what you get an appreciation of is the fact that you go through a process of prioritizing the requirements. Why? Because if you have a fixed time frame within which you can implement or you can design and build this application, you need to be able to prioritize, to identify which are the more important functionalities, and you identify the more important functionalities by interacting with the stakeholders. You don't want a situation where you start wasting time implementing the authentication module when the client would first of all want to make sure that these two are working, right? So anyways, in terms of non-functional requirements, some examples of non-functional requirements associated with this case application here is that the metadata will be encoded, or is supposed to be encoded in a predefined format. In our case, it's ETDMS, it's a metadata scheme. This has nothing to do with the functionality, so it's a non-functional requirement. It has nothing to do with the core features and functionality of this software we are building. Another non-functional requirement is that the descriptive information, the metadata, is going to be stored in a database as opposed to a flat file. Again, this is a non-functional requirement because we can design or we can implement the core functionalities of this system without necessarily storing the metadata into a database. We could just as well easily store them or onto the flat file, or just dump them onto the flat file. Granted, I guess it would be a bit cumbersome and inefficient for us to do that, right? And more specifically, by the way, the metadata is going to be stored in a relational database management system. Now, we could choose to use a non-relational database management system like a document store, for instance, such as MongoDB or CouchDB. But for now, the working non-functional requirement is we're going to store this into a database, preferably a relational database management system, but perhaps a document store like MongoDB. The bit streams will be stored onto the platform in PDF. Again, the storage format of the actual content has nothing to do with the functional requirements, which is why this is a non-functional requirement. The bit streams will be stored onto the flat file, onto the file system, right? We could, I don't know if you've discussed this in 3010, but this idea that you can actually store a binary file as a blob into a database, right? I don't know if have you looked into this? Am I connected?
No, sir. I've not looked into that.
I thought you did the databases. What are you doing now? I've been just started. Aren't you done with databases or something?
You're talking about the blog thing. I haven't
Blob.
done that.
Blob,
Yeah,
not blog. Not blog, not blog, blob. Not blog, blob. Are you done with databases?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Have you looked at data types?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you have those int, you have floats, right? In database, right? And you know this, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it turns out that an alternative data format is a blob. It's a blob, right? You know this. I know you know this. You're just pretending, right? These data types we are looking at, text and whatnot, is an alternative which is a blob. So you can store a file as a blob into a database, right? But anyway, so what we've decided in this application as a non-functional requirement is we are going to store these bit streams onto the file system. And then finally, the application is going to be a third-party web-based application. It's a third-party application, but it's going to be a web-based application. Now, this is an interesting point to note here, because I remember we had a back and forth in one of the interactions, right? The idea that the type, those restrictions that you've been told, right, to say what you're going to do as a group is you build a mobile application, you will build a plugin. That's a non-functional requirement. Why is it a non-functional requirement? Because it doesn't matter whether you build that as a desktop application, as a mobile application, or a web-based application, as an extension, as a plugin, as an add-on. The software is still going to exhibit the core functionalities. So with that being said, the specifics of what sort of application it should be is a non-functional requirement. Yeah, and a key takeaway point here is we've been able to do all of this because we've gone through a thorough requirements elicitation process, where we collect the relevant details that help us figure out, determine, ascertain the specific user requirements associated with the system we are building. If we just walk up and decided to say we're going to build this application without collecting these requirements, in all likelihood, once deployed, this application would not be usable. People would not find it useful. Usability, yeah? Usefulness. Now, I did mention that not all EDTs are non-functional requirements and not all functional requirements are EDTs, right? So usefulness is a non-functional requirement, right? But it's not an EDT. But anyways, I hope this gives you an idea, just a quick walkthrough of what we expect you guys to go through. The next phase we're going to go through is to go through the thorough process of converting these things here into a formal specification, converting these into use cases, deriving system requirements from these functional requirements. And you'll see very soon that this has to be systematically done. You need to follow a predefined formal process here. And there are standards that have been, well, I don't know if guidelines that have been devised that you follow. So things like an SRS document, you just don't come up with your own SRS document. There are templates that are prescribed by entities such as IEEE. And so you just lift a template and you fill in the blanks. I'm going to pause for specific questions, but as people are thinking about specific questions to ask here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insist that you guys find time to go through this document that you will find on the Moodle. Please find time to do this. If you log into the Moodle, when you log into the Moodle, not if, when you log into the Moodle, and I know the English minors are probably laughing at me, so the character doesn't know. When you log into the Moodle, right, you will have access to this document here that says case example, smart IRR deposit problem statement. This has a slightly more details associated with what I walked you through in the slides, right? I do encourage you guys to look at this document. Just go through it because it's coming back. It's a short document, just 3 pages. You want to be able to understand this so that the subsequent steps that we are going to go through make sense, right? You notice that there are some details that we have in here that are not necessarily in the slides here. Are there any questions? All right.
So in terms of the next phase of what we're doing, is it that we have to study the documentation, or are we expected by now to have had at least like a rough draft of the actual our coding of our project? Or is it still, are we still like in the elicitation phase, or at this point
we're still in the requirements engineering phase? I mean, if you've come up with code, it's probably going to be a throwaway prototype, and even more so for you. You know why? Because one of the key stakeholders happens to know exactly what he wants. You haven't asked Light on what sort of features he wants from this application. This project, right? Think of this project, the projects you're doing as being a sort of scenario where a client comes up to you, you're a software development firm, and someone approaches you, asks you, or tells you, this is the sort of software I want. Now, if you say you've already started developing software, question I'll ask you is, how do you know what I want from that piece of software, right? So if you've come up with something, maybe what you could do is use that artifact you've come up with as a basis to start eliciting the requirements. So the next stage, the next set of, it's going to be a brainstorming session for you guys, where you get to look at a specific elicitation technique you're going to use. And there are marks allocated to this, by the way. So if you choose to use interviews, what we will expect you to do is to come up with an interview guide. What we will expect you to do is to upload recordings of the interview sessions that you will conduct with the key stakeholders. The reason you're doing this is because the final report is going to have a component of how you collected the requirements, how you went about developing that piece of software. Why does it have the sort of features it has? So we are going through this in phases. Next stage is analysis and I guess specification, where we look at how we convert these into a formal document. And then we go into the design phase, where we start looking at UML artifacts. Now, the way this works is you just don't write code. You collect requirements, you come up with those design artifacts, context diagrams, architectural diagrams, deployment diagrams, use case diagrams, activity diagrams, network diagrams, right? These are all important because they tell you how to systematically build the software. Quality. There are people that have gotten away with just developing software without going through this thorough process. But if you want to develop quality software that is going to meet the user needs, you better do that. You better learn how to do that. If you don't want the projects that you're going to be working on, or in fact, if you don't want the project you're working on right now to be part of these failed projects here, we need to go through this systematic process. This is the whole essence of software engineering, right? This is why we are studying software engineering. It has little to do with implementation, by the way. We are assuming that you know how to write software, how to write code, which is why I'm going out of my way to tell you to say this is how you interact with RESTful APIs. And I'm doing that because I know that maybe these things were not introduced to you in 2010. And I'm doing that because I have a sneaking suspicion that maybe you might not cover this in 2010, right? But ideally, the focus of this course has little to do with implementation. The only key topic that is going to be remotely associated with implementation is when we look at versioning software, right? So how you collaborate with other people when you're building software. And there's no programming there, essentially. We're just looking at version control software. I hope that makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah. If I were you, right? You might not see this, but if you have even a remote, you even have an interest in building software for a living or working for a software development firm, this is something that you need to learn how to do. If you look at this, you will be able to, information technology assistant. If you look at these companies we have in Zambia, right? These companies that go Zambia, jobs.com. These major companies that are coming onto the scene. What you will notice is that increasingly, and I thought I went through, or I saw an ad for an analyst. What you'll notice is that increasingly, this is all sought after business. Analyst, not analysis. So it's also sought after business. Senior analyst, I hope, probably not. But it's an art. I mean, it's something, typically people that are trained in information systems will gravitate more towards this, but it's an art. It turns out that the organizations that will specifically hunt for people who have experience doing this, people who know how to do this, right? I thought I saw something from BroadPay. Anyway, that's besides the point. All right. So in the next assignment, what we expect you guys to do is to specify details of how exactly you're going to undergo this system interface analysis phase, how you're going to do the data document analysis, and specifics of the data sources. Unless if there are any questions, I guess we can call it a night or something. This was 18th, a horrible time. I wonder if we can change this. Are there any other questions that people might have? I'm very keen to hear questions with regards to the elicitation techniques that you're going to use, right?
So in terms of like the non-functional requirements in terms of the software itself, how is it still, are those still things we need to document or like to analyze? So like you spoke about the Moodle API and or integration with Moodle, which isn't a functional requirement, or how you or what platform you use. In terms of documentation, do you still include those things?
Well, so you would only include those things in the final report, right? When you're explaining, I don't know if people have figured out the process we are following here. In almost all these, almost now 23 assignments that we have, maybe more, maybe less, what I've done is some assignments are not graded per se, with the exception of the corresponding status reports and meeting notes reports. What we are doing is we are trying to make your lives a lot easier so that you already have the information you need to plug into the final report. So we expect you to have a discussion about this. We expect you to undergo a document analysis process. And in fact, you will have to do a document analysis process because you need to read up on the Moodle API documentation. But you will not write the details of what you did anywhere. You just mention it maybe in the report to say, as part of the requirements elicitation process, what we did was we used these techniques: document analysis, system interface analysis. We also conducted interviews and maybe short statements on what exactly you did in terms of document analysis. What exactly did you do? Oh, we read through Moodle documentation to understand exactly how the REST API for Moodle actually works. We did a system interface analysis to identify or to understand exactly how the REST endpoints function. We conducted interviews to elicit the core functional requirements of the system. We used questionnaires to collect user requirements, right? So this is what we expect. And you have to do this because otherwise, I mean, what are you going to write in there? And this process has to be done for you to build quality software. I don't know if that makes sense.
And for elicitation, for among the stakeholders, is it that you have to use, do you have to use one elicitation technique across everybody, or can you use multiple, or is
actually,
it that?
Actually, I was hoping you guys would try and figure out on your own, but you can use multiple stakeholders. It depends on the type of stakeholder, right? So think for a second here. So two things. It depends on the type of stakeholder you're interacting with. It also depends on the number of potential stakeholders. If there are a lot, and you want to make sure that you capture the correct requirements, if it's students, for instance, then you know that you're better off using a questionnaire, for instance. Yeah. If it's a stakeholder, it's a large user-based questionnaires, and we discuss all these characteristics. If you're eliciting requirements from an entity that you know or you feel they're an authentic source, right? They're in a position to give you the sort of output that is going to be comprehensive enough, the sort of requirements that are going to be comprehensive, then interviews are fine. So here's the thing. If you're saying you're dealing with ICT lecturers or lecturer in the Department of Library Information Science, you know that interacting with PL and Lighton should be sufficient. If you're looking at anything to do with BICTs, you know that maybe interacting with PL should be sufficient. If you need clarification, you can always go back to PL, right? So again, to answer your question, you can use more than one technique. You can use interviews for one piece of stakeholder. You can use questionnaires for another stakeholder, right? You can have focus group discussions, although they are not applicable here, right? You can have interviews for all the different types of stakeholders. If you're confident that the information that is going to come your way through interviews is going to be comprehensive enough and correct, then you can do that. A question to ask you is, because when you're interviewing people, right, it's usually a small number. The question to ask is, if you decide to interview students, what sorting technique are you going to use to make sure that the information that is going to come through maybe 2 or 3 people you're going to interview is going to be comprehensive enough, especially for first years, for instance. Ask them about a makeup request, right? How do we know that the information that is going to come through from those 3 people you interview is going to give you a clear picture of what they expect? These are things to think about. If it's a requirement that you might understand, maybe you might get away with an interview session. And I'm throwing this idea of something you understand because you understand the idea of a makeup request, for instance. You understand the idea of ICT, right? But again, you can use multiple techniques, different techniques. The more the merrier, or the better. Any other questions?
Sir, I've got a question concerning our project.
Yes.
Over the integration of API with Moodle. As our project, since it's event sharing, do we need to study APIs for Moodle as well, or just the Google Calendar?
Which events are these though? That's one thing you have to ask yourself. You have to look at the problem. Which events are these?
Event sharing, let's say maybe the ICT has organized the conference or meeting. They need to post an event, something like that.
So the question to ask yourself is, who are the major stakeholders in your project? This is an excellent question, by the way.
Our major stakeholders are ICT students.
Okay. Which other stakeholders do you have?
Stakeholders from the ICT association.
Okay. Who would send out these events you're talking about?
It's on the ICT.
Okay. So a best starting point for you, before you can identify whether you need Moodle or not, is go to ICT and find out from them to say, when they want to send information, I don't know how you send information right now. You first of all ask them, how do you send information, right? Or you can go to them and ask them, do you at any point in time, as ICT, do you send your information using Moodle? Now, last time I checked, I would make an educated guess, it's no, right? Right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so if it's no, then Moodle will be pointless, right? So you need to identify how the information is circulated. I don't know if ICT has a Facebook page or ICT has a WhatsApp group. These are things to think about. But again, this is a clear case of, if you don't know, go and speak to the primary key stakeholders. Like in this case, the entities that are going to be sending the messages. You go to ICT and you find out from them, how exactly do you send messages? What sort of messages do you send? How are the messages sent? Do you send SMSs? Is there a WhatsApp group? Is there a Facebook page? A public Facebook page? There's Facebook Graph API, which you can use. Do you have a Google Groups mailing list? There's an API, right, for Google Groups. You can filter, you can extract emails using the Gmail API, right? So these are things to think about. In certain instances, for some of these projects, you might not know what sort of information you want. So what do? You have an initial interaction with a key stakeholder, like in your class, in your example, ICT. Then find out from them this information that are a bit hazy or fuzzy for you. Any other questions? Maybe we can call it a night now.
Sorry, sir.
No.
Hello.
Yes, hi. Oh, by the way, before I forget, Peter, sorry. You see what happened to me last week, right? I did not practice what I preached. I told you that when you're conducting interviews, make sure that you record. I forgot to record last time. At least I remember I recorded, but I think it just didn't save it. I don't know. But Peter, I wanted to say something.
Yes, sir. So as in, for example, if we decide to say, oh, okay, we're going to use the interviews approach to gather the requirements. Of course, we need to record the interviews that are going to have. But is it going to be at some point going to be uploaded as a part of an assignment or something? I don't know.
Yeah.
Because at some point.
Yes, this is what I said. I know students, and I know students very well. if you think that you're going to manufacture data, it's a bad idea. You will not.
Yeah.
Right. So
okay. Now there seems to be a problem with, for example, if we decide to use probably Google Meet or something, when you try to like save the recordings, it asks you for the G Suite stuff. Like you need to pay for that. So I don't know how we're going to record that.
Yeah, this is your problem. This is your problem, Slim, right? You see, you are one of those people, and it's quite disappointing, really, Victor. You're one of those people who doesn't want to follow instructions. There's a reason why I kept on, from first year, I kept on telling you, learn to use your UNZA assigned email account. If you ask Hawkins and Matthews, they use Google Meet to record their presentation. Did you not, Matthews?
Actually, the problem again is that I'm having a problem with my PC, so I mostly use my phone. So maybe that's probably maybe a problem.
No, again, I'll direct you to Matthews' team. In fact, Matthews is one of those characters who recorded his part of the presentation using his phone. I have given lectures using my phone myself. You can do that.
Yes, sir, we did. We used Google Meet. We didn't pay anything.
Yeah, this is, I keep telling you, there's a reason why I'm directing you in a certain direction. I've been singing about this UNZA assigned email address, not to make your lives difficult, but because I know that increasingly, as you progress high up the ladder, the hierarchy, you will find this feature extremely useful. How are you going to create your Google site if you don't have that? There's a deliverable where you're going to create a project website. How are you going to do that? So the reason you're experiencing problem, Victor, is because you're using a personal email account. And if you're having trouble with your UNZA email account, it's very easy. Peter will tell you, I've seen Peter send an email to support.education@unza.zm. You just send an email, you can send it today, they'll respond to you, explain what your problem is, they'll help you. They're paid to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
If you don't want to use Google Meet, maybe use Zoom or something, and you can record, I'm guessing, with a free tier of Zoom. Alternatively, what you can do is have the person who is able to use their UNZA assigned email account to record the session. Yeah? But if I were you, I would really do that. I would fix the UNZA issue here. Because if you've noticed again, every time you want to get in, you need to be authorized to get in. Your colleagues that log in using their UNZA assigned email account, ask Matthews, ask Moses, ask Peter. They don't have to be wait to be let in. But anyway, that's besides the point. Peter, you had a question?
Yes, sir. I've got a question.
Yep.
The first one is on the issue of recording the presentation you are giving us right now. When we go on that option you showed us, when you place, it's showing like it's already recording. It's saying stop recording. Then after the session, we can't find like where it has recorded or what.
Yeah, well, so when you record a session, like if you look at the session I'm recording right now, when you're recording this session is going to be dumped into the Google Drive, a Google Drive folder belonging to the person who has organized the event.
Okay.
So when I say you should record your interviews, the person who is going to organize the event, similar to what Lighton has done here, when Lighton organizes an event, the person who organizes this event is the one, and this is not here as well. The person who organizes the event is the one who has access to the recording. So when you guys do your interviews, make sure that you identify the person who's going to do the recording, and then you'll find it in a folder called Meet Recordings. You see this? Yeah.
Okay, so that means even if I record, I can't find it myself. It has to be found by you who has created the event.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Then one general question, sir. I don't mean to offend you. Have you tried to consider like enlightening your colleagues, some of those who are not familiar with the Moodle, in the way they are presenting the work? Because truth be told, we are suffering in other courses, and when you try to like reason with them the way they are sending their works, they feel offended. So we thought maybe perhaps if it comes from their colleague, you just come in like you're trying to help and see how we can be helped, because
Yeah. I want to start off by two things here. I want to start off by saying, if you ever want to say anything to me, don't feel, even if it's offensive, I don't take offense. It's a learning process. Just say it out. In fact, I'm happy when people are frank with me, right? You should be honest. If you think that something wrong is happening, and in fact, if you experience something negative and you ask your colleagues and they have similar experiences, what I encourage you to do is if you want, you can approach people anonymously, right? If you want, you can approach them directly and be sincere. Unfortunately, the second part to your statement, unfortunately, I'm a worker ant, I suppose. I'm not in a position where I can advise people on how to structure their work. There's this idea of academic freedom at UNZA. I don't know, you probably experienced this. You are wondering why it's like this, but the reason things are done the way they're done at UNZA is because of this idea around academic freedom. The way Piela teaches is not the way Lighton is going to teach. The way Lighton assesses you in courses is never going to be the way Mr. Tuesday Warrior is going to do it. It's different. So the experiences you're going to have are probably going to be different. Granted, in certain instances, there are certain generic things that are supposed to be common, I guess. There's little I can do there to help, by the way. And I don't know which colleagues you're talking about here, but do you have any specific, I don't know, any specific people? Write me an anonymous email account because we're recording this session, and then I can try and find a more diplomatic way of maybe approaching a colleague and trying to see if I can assist in any way.
Yeah, please, sir, because it will really affect us. They have the work, but they are failing to send it the way it's supposed to be done. So maybe I'll send an anonymous email, then you can
just send it to me. And it's important that you raise these issues because you see, like it or not, the exam is coming, right?
True.
In 3 months' time. Okay. Thanks a lot. If there are no questions, I see there's just 3 people. There's 4 of us remaining in the room. I'll see you when you see me. Thanks.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Right.